Well, hello. My name is Todor Todoroff. I come from Belgium, and I'm going to talk about various things concerning how to reintroduce gestures in electroacoustic music. Actually, there was a time where everything was analog and people were moving faders, moving different sensors, and had a gestural approach to synthesis, for instance, something that we see coming back with the new interest in analog modular synthesis. But at the turning of the 80s, 90s, when the digital era came, and with a lot of new sonic possibilities, there was suddenly, due to the limitation of actually the power of the computers, we went back to some kind of delayed processing where people had to write scores, had to write or draw things or enter numbers, and had to let the computer compute, sometimes for very long. I mean, I talked to some pioneers who were running the computers for the whole night to get a few seconds of sounds. And during this evolution, we lost the use of gesture, and I believe that gesture is something extremely important for both for the audience, but also for the expressivity of composers and performers. Actually, I've been doing some research in a non-profit organization called Acte III, Art, Recherche, Technologie and Music, and I've also been a researcher for many years at the university in Mons, at the Numeniar Institute, and some of the things I will show come from both sources. As initially I was actually interested in making sound experiments. It was mainly studio work, and then as the instruments developed, they were able to do live concerts. I could do interaction with dancers, and I've been working with a dance company for the last 20 years, and also interactive installations. So I was never really motivated by the technology in itself, but by what it could offer. It was some kind of toolbox to help materialize some compositions, some compositional ideas. I was always really interested in controlling in real time the morphology, the morphological profile of a sound. If you might think like bowing a violin, where you are constantly controlling the way it sounds compared to hitting a note on the piano. So I was less interested by triggering things than by controlling them continuously. Then I was also interested in making some algorithms to control the temporal structure of pieces. And another big interest of mine is the spatialization. Tomorrow there will be a piece at 7. I will show a small excerpt, and it will be octophonic sound system. But very often I go beyond that and have many more channels. And then there's this idea, actually, that even though things are completely artificial because they are made within a computer and they are virtual, that you can give them a feeling of likeliness, like if they could really be happening in the real world using different kinds of archetypes. And I think this is a way to bring the listener into the sound universe you are creating. My background is kind of varied. I've been tweaking electronic circuits since I was a little boy. I made an analog modular synth when I was a teenager, and then actually after engineering studies I went to the conservatory into concrete music, electroacoustic music education. And if you think about the early days of electroacoustic music, musique concrète of Pierre Schaeffer, actually they started playing with what they called sound bodies and microphones, and they were actually making sound sequences that they called like sequence jeu, like playing. After that, they would use those sequences, they would edit them, transform them, mix them. And what I wanted to find was a way to bring back this way of playing with the material, this kind of playfulness, spontaneity, expressivity that you can get, but with digital means in order to use the great potential of digital sound generation and transformations. There's this idea of what we call virtual instruments. And virtual instruments, well, why instruments? Because you can play them in a way like an instrument. Virtual because they are not sound bodies. If you have a cello, it has to have this kind of size in order to do those low sounds. You cannot have those low sounds on a violin. So actually the shape of the instrument, the way you play it, really depends on the sound you want to achieve. When you separate the control from the sound generation, you are free to actually associate parameters of gestures to parameters of sound. This is what we generally called the mapping. It's like a correspondence between movement and sound generation. When you do that, you can actually make several different instruments just using the same sound algorithms. And for those of you who are a little bit familiar even with analog effect units, if you have a chorus or an echo or a reverb, they are all based on a delay line. What changes the way they sound is how the parameters of this delay line are changed. And you could have a phaser or a chorus, but basically inside is the same. It's just mapped differently. So that's the idea. And in the course of my work, as I said, I actually went into different directions. It repeats a little bit what I said before, but started in the studio with computers that were not fast enough to do things live with the needed flexibility, and then to live electroacoustic music. And there's also all those things about how can you combine electroacoustic music with acoustical instruments, and there are different schools, one could say. There's the idea of the augmented acoustical instrument. Todd McCover told about that in the 90s, with adding sensors to the instrument to be able to trigger different sounds. You can, and that has been done later, give sensors to the performer who plays the instrument rather than put those on the instrument. And then is even more recent, there are people who are actually analyzing the sound of the instrument, and through the analysis of the sound of the instrument they can detect how it was played. For instance, about 10-15 years ago, more even, there was someone who actually, by analyzing the sound of a guitar, could tell where it was plucked. There are people who put a few microphones on a surface, and by analyzing the sound you get from the microphone, you can know at what where you touched the surface. So it's a way actually not to put special sensors, but just by the sound of it to be able to find how it was performed or played. Also works for wind instruments, etc. And then there are also electronic instruments, and I guess here, because we are in the country where it was invented, most people know about the theremin, which was the first instrument to be played without touching it. Everyone knows about it? Or not everyone behind, it seems. I can actually show a few. I have a little video of, and it will be the only part in Russian in my presentation.
Электромузыкальный инструмент термингокс – это первый инструмент такого типа. Это песенно-голосовой инструмент. В нем управление мелодией достигается посредством движения руки и пальцев в зависимости от исполняемой мелодии. Без прикосновения к чему бы то ни было, посредством влияния на электромагнитное поле около инструмента.
Well, that's a little bit the idea. It was kind of revolutionary, and those instruments can also be used in the way I just explained. I made some pieces where a theremin player is playing a normal theremin, but there's an analysis process behind that analyzes the pitch and the height and use those gestures just like two controllers. And I will show examples of variation on that principle. So let's go back to this. And then actually most of the things we can do with instruments for concerts, we can also do with dance. And actually, Theremin himself had the terpsichord, which was actually an instrument designed to dance, for dancers, with the same principle of electric field in a way, like a capacitor of the human body that would change the frequency of an oscillator. With the company I worked with, the choreographer initially didn't want the dancers to wear anything, so the idea was to find various ways to create interaction without putting anything on the body of the dancers that would limit their ability to move. And we use a lot of things with the surfaces they would touch, like contact mics on the surfaces they would walk, or they would do ground movements, pressure gauge, force gauge with elastics, things like this, ultrasound, camera sensing, etc. And I will also show some examples with worn accelerometers, and actually I brought some of the original ones that I built in 2007, and you will be able to test them and to do exactly like or similar to the dancer you will see on the video. The idea is that when you have dancers, when you have rehearsal time, actually some dancers have a quite good ear, have a musical background, and can actually really perform like musicians in some way. But it really depends on them. If you have a group of them, it's better to take the time to see who fits and who doesn't. For instance, the choreographer I've been working with has worked 10 years with Stockhausen, and she has a very exerted ear, and is interested in doing this effort to actually rehearse and to acquire what we call a gesture, an expert gesture. Like, you know, someone spends 10-15 years to learn how to play the violin or the piano, but sometimes one expects that because it's new instrument, you should be able to learn them overnight. Well, it's not the case. If you want to do something interesting with new instruments, you also have to practice, you also have to work. And I think this is it's maybe a digression, but I think it's an important thing. If we want to get to something subtle with new instruments, we need actually at some point to decide we keep this instrument as it is for a while, and we allow the performer to be able to master it. Because we all have in our field the tendency to want to make the instrument better and better and better, and we are changing it, and the performer can never learn how to play it. So that's a little bit an issue. Well, those are just a few pictures of some choreographies I worked on. I will pick a few ones where there's special interest in sensors and interaction. So it gives an idea a little bit of the visual world. And then there are the interactive installations where the audience actually visits the installation in a museum type of gallery type of setting. And then again, there's the question, how will they react? What will they do? How will they experience the thing? How much do you have to explain to them in order for them to get it? How much do you let them discover, etc.? I'll show some examples. Maybe some basics, actually. Sometimes it's interesting to go back to the old means, because we sometimes have a lot of plugins, a lot of things that allow to do transformation now, and without really understanding how they work. I was always interested in transferring the energy and some elements of a recorded sound into electronic means, where they would keep kind of the trace of it. And for instance, this could be done much easier now. I tried in this piece, Obsession, in '91 to actually get the energy of the sound of water and to be able to explore it in different ways. At that time, I didn't have fast Fourier transform algorithms and so on, so I used just simple pitch to MIDI converters in different narrow bands, and I would record one band after another into a sequencer. It was Pro 24, the ancestor of Cubase, and then those notes was a material I could play with, and I could write an algorithm, for instance, that would use the notes I was playing on the keyboard like magnets for all those notes coming from the analysis of water, and having faders to define how much they would be attracted. So actually, it's a way to create a new instrument that has the memory of the sound that was analyzed. I have a small example here. So it sounds a little bit like drops of water, but everything is synthetic, but made from the analysis of the water. So that's an example. Another technique that I show other applications later is granular synthesis. And actually, you take a sound. I don't know how many of you are actually doing sound, or so it's difficult. Yeah. Okay. So I don't know if I'm too basic for some, too complicated for others. Granular synthesis, there are many ways to do it, but it would be maybe called more granulation because it's based on a recorded sound, on a sound in memory. It's the idea that you can take a bit of sound somewhere within the whole sound that you have recorded, and that bit of sound you can play it forward or backwards at different speed, making transposition factors, and this transposition factor is independent from the speed at which you are going through the original sound. So you can do time stretching, time compression independently of pitch, and pitch changes independently of time. Contrarily to, as you know, I guess most of you, if you have a tape, if you play the tape faster, it will get faster and it will have a higher pitch. Here you can move the things independently, and if you are actually having some way to control how the different grains, you can have different chains in parallel, they can have some kind of delay between them, you can assign them to different speakers, and then you can create textures that also have a spatial nature. And in this, my interest was actually to have some faders. This is the representation in Max. It was on a Next computer at that time, but it was actually 16 faders, and I could really play it, which was kind of new at that time because most of the people, well, actually all of the people who were using granular synthesis at that time were actually drawing scores or having formulas to define how things would change over time. And I was always convinced that when you can actually change the parameters in real time, you start discovering sound possibilities that you cannot imagine if you just have to beforehand define the parameters. So it's also a fast way to actually explore a sound domain. This is a very short example of just a spoken sentence stretched very long, and you start hearing the melody of the prosody of the sentence. Then I said I was interested also in structuring time, and I was interested in the model of the pendulum, where, you know, if you have a pendulum like on a clock, when it's been a while before you have actually the amplitude of the weight is actually getting smaller, but the rhythm is still the same. So it's this kind of isosynchronicity, and I was interested in using that when you have actually a pendulum which is swinging from left to right, and each zones would actually trigger a sound in a sampler. So when the pendulum was slowing down, it would spend different amount of times in different zones. It would have different speeds when it enters zones, and you would create something with a pulsation that is recognizable, but that is constantly slightly changing. I can let's hear a little example. So actually different sequences were played and then mixed, edited like a normal musique concrète way. But each of those sequences were made by moving faders that would change the parameters of the pendulum, including sending forces to it to disturb it, and doing things that would not be possible in a real pendulum, like putting a negative gravity or putting like a rubbing force with ear that is negative and things like this. And you still feel the pulse, but it's never really repeats itself exactly. It could be more complex with different forces on a 2D space and etc. With different physical laws, and actually there are a lot of things that look beautiful but that don't sound well at all. I mean, it's too complex sometimes for the ear to follow, and one doesn't feel any kind of intention like it would be felt in the piece before. So sometimes actually you develop algorithms, you try things, and some things just don't sound well, and it's better to trash them. And so about sensors, actually, I don't know if you're familiar with ultrasounds. It's the echolocation principle of the bats. So they send a sound, they wait for the reflection, and by measuring the difference between the time between the moment where they emit the impulsion and it comes back to them, it gives them an indication of the distance. That's how they hunt for insects. But actually, this can also be used to find out at what distance a dancer, for instance, or a visitor in an interactive installation is from the sensor. So it's quite a simple sound algorithm, but I think it's quite effective because, of course, it's dance, but also because you feel immediately the link, the correlation. You may leave it turned off maybe there will be a video very soon after. You remember what I said about the granular synthesis? Now we will see the same principle with ultrasound sensor, but the distance of the ultrasound will move the place where the grain is taken from the initial sample. So there will be a correspondence between the distance of the dancer and from the sensors and the place of the sound. The sensor is here. Those are absurd sentences from a Cocteau movie. Well, then I told about some sensors, how to sense the surfaces, and I did some things with contact mics and with having different controls on the analysis of the intensity of detected on the contact mics. Different things can be done, and particularly in this performance, where we had a podium 3 by 3 meters divided in 4 quadrants, and on each of them there was a contact mic with several sound sources, and like here everything is triggered by the dancer. So one see the 4 plates, there's one mic underneath each of them. The fan is a little bit loud, so we don't hear the small sounds. But So what we saw at the end was a mix between the real sound created and a Nova shot that was filmed before and edited. Remember this example where she was moving through a voice by moving forward toward the sensor. Actually, the same platform that we just saw was mounted on four sensors, so that actually by knowing how much weight to the left, how much to the right, one could know the position from left to right. If we look at the two sensors at the front and the two sensors at the back, we can see the Y position between the front and the back. So actually we can measure the center of gravity of the sensor, of the dancer, sorry, and with this center of gravity we can move through sentences. And we had actually 4 sentences of a poem that were organized in 2 diagonals and 2, like one from front to back, one from right to left, with the color filter version. So I'm going to show only a small excerpt of it, but it gives an idea of how the dancer can start playing with the phonemes of the poem. And in order for those things to happen, actually I set up the system at her place. I showed her how to start the sensors and the computer. It was kind of automatical for the computer. So she could try, she could experiment, and then we would come back and we would define and refine some things. So here it is. So it's Granular Synthesis. This is the G from God. It was actually not very intuitive at the first because it's the center of gravity, not the position of the feet. So if she's moving her hand, without moving her feet, the center of gravity moves forward. And it's sensed by the system.
Aussi, isso, aussi, isso, aussi, isso, aussi, isso, ici, ici, je, merge, ici, isso.
Another project was quite interesting, and it's where I started developing more of those inertial sensors. It was by an Australian artist, Margie Medlin, and it was called Quartet. And the quartet consisted in one musician, one real dancer, one virtual dancer, and one robot. So for this project, we made some research. We had some contact with people at the Cambridge University, And actually we made some, I guess most of you who are music know the idea of the vocoder, so you actually impose the spectrum of one sound on the source of another. Actually, it can be more interesting to do it with filters that mimic the way the hearing actually works. I'm not going to enter into the details, but I did some patches where I can change the frequencies of the filter. They're spreading over the frequency range, so you can actually achieve a lot of different timbres. You can also change the resonances, and there are other things which are based on the analysis of each of the partials in a sound, and then each of those partials can be transformed, pitch shifted, transposed, can be modulated, etc. And resynthesis, this is something that I will use quite a lot tomorrow. And basically, in all my patches, I have like a big matrix, which is like you have the inputs, the physical inputs, the outputs of the instruments that enter into the matrix, and they're directed to the input of the virtual instruments and to the outputs, the sound outputs to the speakers. And faders that allow to change all the parameters. And getting to the sensors, those sensors were developed like 2005, 2007 for this quartet project. And they consisted in a gyroscope. A gyroscope is measuring the rate of rotation, an accelerometer, and the accelerometer measures the acceleration, as it says, but one could say there's a static and dynamic acceleration, the static one being the gravity that is always 1G pointing to the center of the Earth. So in those days, the chip for the oscilloscopes, gyroscopes were quite big. So that is a little bit how they look, and it's actually the same sensors that are here. And then actually we also did some kind of theremins on the violin. These are like digital theremins. And we worked with the instrument maker in order to make an extension to the touch of the violin. One sees it here. So actually there was a way to control parameters by touching it, or by just depending on the distance of the hand to those two antennas. And two other antennas were put on strings on the violin, which obviously had to be metal and not gut. I won't enter into the details, but we have a parameter, a sensor input. There's this kind of boxes for every parameter of the sound, where you choose which sensor axis, and then you can actually modify, select a range of the sensor variation that you want to use, apply it to a range of the parameters, putting some smoothing, some filtering, inverting, putting tables, and so on, in order to tailor and to map the things as good as you wish. I might actually show a small example, but this is on VLC, of this quartet project. I'm not sure anymore about the full, how does it work, full screen here, does it? Yep. So the performer is Stevie Wishart. She's Anglo-Australian, and you can see here, well, she had a lot of things, because she has a vocal mic, she has the mic for a violin, and she has sensors. You see some elements. Okay, let's play some bit. So I need to say that actually we made some not only gesture analysis but also sound analysis, both of the acoustical sound of the violin and of the results. And we worked with 3 choreographers actually in a way to map the sound of the violin and the transformations to the body of the virtual dancer. So there was some kind of mapping to make the dancer moving. It was developed in 2006, so I mean in terms of 3D, it's a lot of progress have been made since then, but it shows an idea. So actually the dancer moves through the way she plays. I will just pick a little bit at random different places of the. So here the musician is almost like a dancer. I think there are some excerpts on the website of the Quartet project. If we go back, so a little bit, those sensors were used in different ways. I will show just, I told you about the theremins. The theremins were used also in a sound installation where it was not a performer, but it was the general audience, and actually reservoirs of water were used as theremin antennas. There were very thin metallic wire connecting them, almost invisible in the dark, to the electronic. There were 4 of those reservoirs. It was also 4 ultrasound sensors and contact mics, but it gave some kind of global sound universe modified through the theremin, which also modified, you will see it on the video, the image, which is projected on a big screen. So there was also a visual indication in those water. There was a light that showed the audience that they were actually interacting and helped them maybe understand, because we didn't explain at the beginning of the installation how it was working. There are just other things that are quite interesting, but I won't actually anyway. I cannot show anything on two speakers. But at ZKM, there's this cube with 44 loudspeakers and with a software to allow to move sounds across them, and I could write some algorithms to actually have coordinated movements of several sources, and it was quite interesting. And about the contact mics, and then we get to the sensor that you will be able to try. You remember we showed this thing with the contact mics with the dancer on the ground. They are also here, it's used on a scenography, it's a metal scenography. There are 4 contact mics, there are 2 dancers. It's a little bit troubling because there's a video camera at the back, a camera at the front. There are metal grids that can seem like a projection screen, but if there's a light behind, you see the dancer through. So sometimes you don't know where the dancer is, where his image is. And then the sounds come from the interaction with the structure. All the video was done in Isadora and the sound in Max MSP. and we'll get to the utilization of the sensors, the same as Stevie Wishart were using in the excerpts I show you about the quartet project, except they are not placed in the same part of the body and they are used differently. So basically, the dancer has only two sensors which are attached to his upper arms, and with the accelerometer, mainly the orientation in relationship to the vertical is measured. So, like if his arm is down, let's say it could be the rest position, but if he is going like this, doesn't matter what his elbow does because it's here, then suddenly there will be an increase in one axis of the sensors. And if he moves his arm to the back, then it would be the 1g of gravity would be applied to another axis. And so by changing this, he can actually control the level of different sounds which are played in loop behind. Also, and it's in this example applied more to the left arm, there's the speed of rotation. So if he makes a rotation of his arm, then there will be sounds depending on the speed of rotation. But if this is the speed of rotation, if you're standing and if you're rotating on yourself, for the sensor, it's exactly the same. So there's always a lot of ways to actually try to understand how to use those things, because depending on the position, the relative positions of your arms, it might do different things that you don't imagine at once. So it's a lot of trial and errors and try to find the things that work. Here I show the example. There's no other sound sources, he controls everything. The other dancer had no sensors, and I will show another example of exactly the same sensors worn exactly on the same part of the bodies, but to revive what I said before, you have a virtual instrument, so control is dissociated from production, and you can change the mapping, you can change the sound, and actually get something completely different with the same setup. So here is... here we go back to the contact mics. We got this kind of conversation, which is only her rubbing her body on the surface, being detected by contact microphones. Well, I think this shows also how we can be induced into believing, thinking about something if you just put the right conditions. Because most people see in this like a conversation, but it's actually pre-recorded whisperings that are just triggered by the rubbing of the bodies on the surface. Before going further, I was going to propose to actually try, for some voluntaries, to actually try those senses that we've seen. And I will show the max patches that do the things, and we can see. So, we started. And if you go back, you have another sound. And here, if you were going up, you had this kind of, and actually the speed goes down with it, and it gets very slow there. It's just a clock. But of course, at all moments, I can change all the parameters. this would be like a transposition effect that depends also on some of the sensors. Maybe someone else wants to try? I don't know. Okay. Actually, there you have something. It's always back and forth between some proposals and the dancer and trying to find where is it more interesting and oh, I like that, how can we make this work better, how can we tweak this. So actually it's always time consuming to get to a result that we want to show in the final show. Well, I would like to show something totally different. In terms of sound installation, but actually close in some way in the fact that it refers to the body. It's an installation I did with the same video artist who did the images for the show of tomorrow, the Colombian video artist Laura Colmenares Guerra. It's actually her idea, this installation, and it's for 4 people around a pool with breathing mask. The idea is that you interact with the interaction by breathing. We tried different solutions, and the solution that was the most effective was actually those anesthetic masks, because one could clean them, one could change the filters, it was hygienic, we didn't want everyone to get tuberculosis if one had. Actually, the system of sensing is relatively simple. If you breathe in, you actually lower the pressure within the mask. If you breathe out, you increase the pressure. And so we have, the sensors are not directly connected to the mask, but we have small tubes. And the tubes are connected to an electronic where you have sensors that measure the difference between the pressure in the tube and the atmospheric pressure. And so we get immediately the force of the inhale and the force of the exhale. And on top of that, we did put a small electret microphone so that we had also the sound of it. It's just to show a little bit the idea, and not to go into details, but a little bit like we did with the sensors before. We have extracted for each participant, each of the four, the pressure in the mask. It has been conditioned so that we have two signals. One is an exhale signal, one is an inhale signal, and that triggers actually filters and just synthesis in this case, or playing of loops. And there is one video. It's a little bit long, but it explains the principle. I don't think I will go to the end. And actually, there's a website, and on my website there are links to other sites. There are a few videos, but there are also links to Vimeo and YouTube, and you can find those things, links to the project. So if you want to have the full version of it. Oh yes, I didn't say those. It's jellyfishes. Those are really real jellyfishes that were shot in kind of a zoo, aquatic zoo. They were extracted one by one, and they were mapped into a texture, and the texture is modified by the interaction. So, and when you inhale, the jellyfishes expand. When you exhale, they contract. And we have different ways of them moving depending on the sequence. It's actually a 10-minute long cycle. It's a little bit a meditative thing at the beginning. It becomes a little bit wilder at the end.
Lungs, the breather, est une installation intérieure.
Sorry, I put the French version.
Les processus physiques involontaires en les amenant dans le domaine du conscient par l'amplification et l'intensification.
Well, basically, it's a projection on liquid. So it's liquid with white paint, white ink. So it's really liquid, and people are around it. I will go a little bit further, and there's a little bit the explanation. So maybe I show a little bit this animation of. So it's maximum 4 people, and we have 8 speakers, like a quadrophony around the audience, and then like a speaker for each one in his back, where we project the sound of his own breathing, transformed or not, depending on the sequence, so that everyone is actually listening also to the breathing of the others. And something really interesting happens when this unconscious act of breathing becomes conscious through the sound and through the manifestation in the way the jellyfishes move. And also, in terms of a social interaction, people tend to synchronize. Sometimes people see that more with friends coming together to the installation. They actually try to do counterpoints or being in a rhythm together, directing. It's kind of funny the way people interact with it. Some people feel like it's like some kind of yoga session, zen, and some others get really trying to play to the point that they might hyperventilate a little bit. So it's a scenario, and in some ways it's more, in some places it's more obvious than others, like this one, where they move in line. You breathe out, you have each one has 4 jellyfishes, they move away from you, you breathe in, they come back to you, and they intermingle with the 3 other groups of 4. Okay, I won't be much longer onto this, but that's one of the less usual type of sensors that we used. And this is a project actually that was never finished, but I think the process is interesting, and it was a process. The idea is that you have a dancer like a sleeper that goes into different positions, and she's a real dancer which has been recorded, and it has been recorded in such a way that there are moments where she gets in the same position in different sequences, so that you can navigate between them through the movements of the people. I will show a part of it. Well, it is in English. So this was a work done at the university with other researchers. And this is the digital theremin, which is reminiscent to the ones you've seen on the violin. But it's extremely difficult to tweak the adjustable potentiometer. So the thing is to have a digital control oscillator instead, and then you can reach a much higher precision. And these were first tryouts to actually map it to a system of virtual physical model. So that's an idea I would like to move forward in the following years. There are things we did also going from these first experiments with the dance and Stevie Wishart on her violin. There was an encounter with a viola player who was also dancing, and she wanted to explore how she could play the viola while dancing and controlling sounds and modifying the sound of her own instruments. And I show an element of it. Here she has actually the sensors are on her ankles. Almost all the sounds triggered were obtained by special playing techniques, were recorded from the alt viola. well, I won't go further now, but in order to do certain of those things, we developed some kind of interpolation algorithm that allow to move in a space of parameters, and you place sets of parameters in different locations, and then you move around those locations, and it's a little bit like a planetary system where if it's a big planet, it has more influence than if it's a small one. It's inspired by Interpol, this is the name of it, a tool that existed on the CITER at the GRM in the 80s, 90s. And then we used some different types, 1D, 2D, or 3D interpolation. And we also developed some algorithms for gesture recognition using dynamic time warping techniques, and those techniques compare a gesture in a library with a gesture being, well, all the gestures in the library with a gesture being played. It tries to find the way with the minimum error with all the gestures, and then gives the most likeliness of one gesture if there is one that is likely enough. And the interesting thing about dynamic time warping is that you don't have to do the gesture exactly at the same speed. You can slow down at some moments, speed up, and it will still try to find the best way to minimize the error and to because if you redo a gesture just afterwards, you will be able to do it almost perfectly the same. But the next day or a week later, no way. So actually, the system has to be able to take care of a certain type of variability in the way you do a gesture over time. Otherwise, it will never be able to recognize a gesture. And this technique is interesting because compared to hidden Markov system, it doesn't need a training. You can, on the fly, add a new gesture to the algorithm and play with it. And that's quite interesting. I have a small video about this. So it's again the same. Well, those are the sensors that you've seen. But maybe I go back to this, actually, because that's one of the reasons. For instance, if you want to have a pitch transposition with something like the leg she did on the video, you don't want to have a glissandi all the time. Sometimes you want to have just like no transposition, maybe a third, a fifth, whatever, but you want to be able to tune it. And with this interpolation, you can define the zone where you have a specific interval, and you can decide whether you change by a glissando in between, or if you make jumps. So those are quite interesting to fine-tune how you map parameters to sound algorithms. Okay, I go a little bit.
There are several different factors of transposition which are given and controlled by the.
Well, I don't know if it's clear, but it was this thing. Yeah.
This computer here computes the DTW, recognizing the gestures, and then sends information to this computer who does the sound processing, and the presets are changed according to the gesture detected.
This is in French. And those are the new sensors, actually, that we want to test now. maybe because I'm a little bit afraid, because we're using them for the concert tomorrow. But you see the box is much smaller, and each of the sensor is only 2 grams. And the cellist is going to wear those ones for the concert tomorrow. So we have like a Wi-Fi transmitter, and that's the same principle as the other. We do have a digital bus, I2C for people who know, with only 4 wires that connect all the sensors together, and it's a digital protocol that exchanges information. And then it's a little bit like you've seen before for the other thing, except that now you have 3-axis gyroscopes and magnetometers. They feel the magnetic earth field. Who doesn't like to play with fire? I do like to play with fire. And we had a great project. We had a guy who does shows with flame, who came to see us at the university, and he wanted to find a way to control 20 glass flames. And so we started to make some algorithms just to make patterns, and it gives something like this. It's amazing, but they let us do this inside the university building. So if you make a very short throw, you get kind of balls of fire instead of flames. And then I called in a dancer. I won't go into the details, but we also made some algorithms to track people with what we call stereoscopic cameras. So it's 2 cameras next to each other, and they, by the measure of the small differences, they can locate the position of people. And it's basically like a blob that you would have in 2D, but you have it in 3D, and it's much more precise. And in this video, the position and height of the dancer is used actually to control the flames. And of course, we can have different patterns. It's not always easy to find a pattern that is comprehensible by the viewer. The camera was somewhere here, or here. We needed some distance. I cannot zoom, so. It's not a show, it's just test sequences. Get very warm. And actually, when I said just before, when you're turning your arm like this, or when you have it like this and you turn your body is the same. Actually, I had set it up, and then I wanted to go back to my computer, and I went by the flames, I put it, and I was just at the flame, and then suddenly the flames were jumping. So it's kind of a little bit dangerous. And then we try to combine kind of everything together with the alt player, and where she had still the sensors on her ankles. There was analysis of her alt viola playing, and well, just for the inauguration of the institute, we had a very little performance. I just show a little bit of it. And we had two flames on the sides. You see it vaguely. The system also shows its limits. We had ideas of very complicated flame patterns, but basically you see it on the computer, but you don't get it. And there was, when she was hitting some note, there would be this kind of flame pattern that will be kind of triggered. You can see the smoke. Well, those things are on the web, so time is passing by. I go a little bit further. So those sensors actually can be used also for other things, because once you fuse the data with the gyroscope, accelerometers and magnetometers, you can get what one calls the attitude. So it's a direction in space, and not only the direction towards the vertical like we had with the accelerometer, but also in the horizontal plane. And if you know the length of the arms or the skeleton, and if you put it kind of right, you can. This is what they put in some combinations where they put actors for video games, for instance, where sometimes it's only visual things. They have like white balls on the body, and it's a system of 10, 20 cameras that track them. Sometimes they have also a system based on this. And maybe I show a small video of how those sensor works and what they actually have. Maybe you know Alexander Schubert from Hamburg. He used the sensors. So actually that was my choice initially. But let's go with this. So this is the attitude. There is a small lag, but it's less than the Kinect. With 3 sensors on the upper arm, lower arm and hand. I have a small, I don't know, trailer of the show of tomorrow. Maybe it doesn't show enough the sensors, but oh, I should have put it big screen. So tomorrow there will be a cellist, and the cellist wears sensors on her hands and arms. And with these sensors, she can modify the sound of her acoustical instrument. She can also trigger some sounds, control some sounds. And part of that information is sent to the video computer running jitter, who transforms the video accordingly. There's also sound analysis, intensity, pitch, partials. It has some rather melodic parts, some rhythmical parts, some more experimentals. It will use an octophonic sound system, does use quite a lot of delays, multi-tap delays, spatially organized to make some rhythms that go back and forth from side to side. I would like to show just one more thing. This was an installation. I'm not very happy with the video that was made of it. It should be redone, but an installation that used laser scanners to detect the position of the people on two catwalks, and you had it controlled automatic lights, automatic profiles that were moving like pendulum. It's a little bit the idea of the pendulum I showed at the beginning, but in 3D, in a real space, where you have two pendulum desynchronized, and people by their presence are activating zones, and when they are activated, those zones will sound when the pendulum enters them. Okay, I know it's a little bit complicated to explain. So you see the blue line that follows the people, and when the blue line touches one of the zones, it activates them, and then it becomes apparent in the middle section and will be activated by the pendulum. People were playing very differently. Some discovered that actually the laser scanners were very close to the ground. If they were jumping, they were not detected anymore. And then they started jumping. One last thing. Actually, there's a pioneer of electroacoustic music in Belgium. He's called Leo Kuper, and he made between 63 and 86 this huge synthesizer that is almost like an experimentation board that takes 4 meters long, 1.5 meters high. And I've started, it hadn't been used since 86. And I'm starting to checking everything in order to be able to represent it. This is how it looked like it was cabled somewhere in 86 with hundreds of cables. And it was completely crazy because he's a guy who was a pioneer also of sound domes. And at the maximum he had 104 loudspeakers in Linz in 86. But he had one generating circuit for each of those speakers. So he was not making trajectories, he was making a circuit per speaker. And he was making some kind of electronic jungles. So within here, this thing, there were like 100 sounds coming out from that, sent to the things. And he had also what he called sound automata. And actually it's little box, and they have a microphone. It's like a bistable oscillator, and you can kind of program it. The microphone, the sound is kind of éclaté, how do you say that? Clipped, and then it goes to a frequency divider, and it means that you can have long time of reactions. And I decided to use 4 of them for a concert this year. It was both stressing and actually exciting. A little bit stressful because sometimes they don't sound and you want them to have a sound. And I thought maybe it's a nice way to end this talk. He's also a little bit of a poet, and he told me, birds don't sing all the time. And so sometimes you have to be patient with those machines that he wanted to make actually kind of organic and kind of a electronic jungle. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.